right, guys, Phil Talk, and today I brought Dr. Tim Stratton, and we're going to be talking about Christian thought, Christian apologetics, some philosophy. And one of the first questions I have for you, Dr. Stratton, is how should a Christian even approach philosophy? I mean, doesn't the Bible warn of like vain philosophy? I want to get your thoughts on that, and maybe after a short introduction of how you got into apologetics, but that's going to be our first question.
Yeah. Okay. So should I answer that question or give you say a little bit
about a little intro to yourself, but then the kind of broad theme here is how does philosophy relate to Christianity?
Yeah, you bet. Well, first, Danny, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm really honored to have this invitation, and just with given our few minutes of conversation before we went live, I can tell you and I are going to become fast friends, even if we see things a little bit differently. Yeah, my name is Tim Stratton. I really got into apologetics and theology and taking philosophy seriously kind of through the back door. I was a youth pastor for years. And I was one of those youth pastors that really didn't think too deeply about things. And I'd always say, hey, well, this is what the Bible says. You better believe it. And if not, you just need to believe harder. Try harder and believe, have more faith, whatever. And I realized probably back in 2008 that this wasn't cutting it. And that a lot of the students in my youth group were really struggling with their faith. In fact, some of them were losing it and rejecting it. And I'll never forget one young man. He was a junior in high school at the beginning of that year. He'd been in my Bible study for the previous 2 years since he was a freshman. And he came up to me and said, Tim, I'm not coming back to youth group or your Bible study or church at all. I'm an atheist. I became an atheist over the summer. And I'm like, well, why would you do a thing like that? And he goes, well, I've been watching YouTube. I've been watching Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Christopher Hitchens and fill in the blank with your favorite atheists. and I said, well, that's not true. You've read the Bible with me. And he goes, yeah, I don't believe the Bible anymore. I said, but it says it's the word of God. So you got to believe it. And he goes, Tim, stop begging the question. And back then I didn't even know what begging the question was. And so a 16-year-old is schooling me about logical fallacies. And then he starts giving me objections to Christianity, from everything from the problem of evil to, evolution to, so many things. And I didn't know how to answer any of them. And so really at the end of that night, not only did I see him and some of his friends become atheists, my faith was actually rocked and shaken. And I started having doubts. And so I went on a journey to see if there were, if I could defend my faith, I guess, and to see if there were reasons to think if Christianity was true. And I got to tell you, I went to Biola University and got a master's degree in apologetics, and then went on and did a PhD in theology. But during that time at Biola, I haven't told this to a lot of people, but during that time at Biola, man, we were looking at all the arguments against Christianity. And at one point during that time, my faith was, if it wasn't below 50%, it was right there. And now I'd say though it's been built back up. But with that said, I highly respect those like you who take a different position and see things differently. And I just love having these conversations. So anyway, my doctoral dissertation has recently been published in a book by Whippenstock. It's called Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. And
I've been seeing Christians that I know take pictures with this book, like it's their the book right next to their Bible at this point. So I heard really good things about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I look at it now. Just yesterday, I don't know how this happened, but one of the key quotes that I had in the historical section that I really thought was going to make my point. It was in my doctoral dissertation, but for some reason it didn't get transferred to the book. So there's just little things that I'm finding, some typos and missing block quotes and things like, not a lot, but just a handful that, during the second edition, those things have to be rectified. But anyway, I have a website called freethinkingministries.com. Also have a YouTube show. So people want to subscribe, go to YouTube, search for Free Thinking Ministries and subscribe there. And we have a podcast called the Free Thinking Podcast. But so I love talking about these things. And I take theology and philosophy very seriously. Now, you ask how a Christian should approach philosophy, especially since Paul warned us of vain philosophy, right? And that's Colossians 2:8. And you're exactly right. The Bible does warn us about being taken captive by the shallow philosophies, another interpretation says. But it seems to me that that's basically synonymous with illogical thinking. It seems to me that that's what Paul's saying. Don't be taken captive by bad thinking. And I don't think anybody would say that we ought to be taken captive by shallow thinking or bad thinking or incoherent ideas, right? Atheists and Christians should agree on that. So, in fact, I'd say that Paul, the Apostle Paul, implies that we ought to take our bad thinking captive in 2 Corinthians 10:5. And so, according to Paul, Christianity, I think, really comes down to the battle of the mind, which brings Romans 12:2 to mind, no pun intended. But that is to say that we are to take bad thinking captive before bad thinking takes us captive. So we got a 2 Corinthians 10:5 versus a Colossians 2:8 kind of thing going here. And so with that said, let's think about Paul. The same guy who issued that warning about shallow philosophy, he was a fantastic philosopher in his own right. He would basically rent out auditoriums or lecture halls or whatever to debate the Greek philosophers of the day. In fact, the Bible tells us that this was Paul's custom and tells us that some were persuaded. It doesn't say that everybody was persuaded, but it says that some were persuaded. And so, I think that's how we should take it today. Christians ought to have their feet wet when it comes to philosophy. We ought to take it seriously. And so I think the New Testament is pro-philosophy. And when you think about Jesus too, I think he was a good philosopher. I think he was a great philosopher. You look at all of his parables, those seem to me to be just fantastic thought experiments to try to show people ultimate reality and the way we ought to view things, ought to view the world. So, that's New Testament. Think about the Old Testament. One of my favorite scriptures is found in the Old Testament, and it's usually the scripture that I like to sign off with my blog articles on my website, and that's Isaiah 1:18, which says, "Come, let us reason together, says the Lord." Now, if reasoning together isn't good philosophy, I don't know what is. So anyway, I take philosophy and theology very seriously, and I think that's implied in Scripture that we ought to take philosophy seriously. And sadly, I don't think many Christians do that.
There's also, when I read Kierkegaard, there was a passage, that Kierkegaard talks about the leap of faith, and he depicts faith as almost irrational. And he cites, Abraham as an example, that when Abraham heard the command of God, that it wasn't a matter of reason, it was a matter of leap of faith. But then I wrote a paper because I think in Hebrews 11, the last part of that chapter, it talks about how Abraham reasoned that, well, God could just bring him back from the dead, right? God could just do this and that. And there is this, I think the view is called fideism, right? That the view that like faith and reason are divorced and completely different categories. And it always amuses me in the best way when a religious person or a Christian or a Muslim come to try to engage with analytic philosophy, right? And and it's actually, as you know, had such an impact on analytic philosophy. Some of the greatest philosophers of this current time, right, are Christians, like Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga, right, respected by atheists, Peter Van den Wagen, Richard Swinburne. These are huge icons now, right? And they're motivated by their faith, right? And I love that, right? And it's rippled, towards I don't want to say, non-philosophy of religion topics and domains in philosophy. There's a lot of influence. So no, I think that definitely if one is a Christian, that philosophy is actually something that you could definitely more than approach. You can contribute to the whole domain as like these people did. But now you said you got your PhD in theology. So
That's right.
People, what do you think is the relationship between, so we talk about Christianity and philosophy, right? What about the relationship between theology and philosophy? Do you think theology is just a kind of branch of philosophy, or do you think theology kind of uses philosophy? What do you have to say about that?
That's a really good question. And so since I've already referenced scripture, since I'm going to be balanced here, let me reference an atheist who I respect. You got to give credit where credit is due. And, I think Dan Dennett once said something that really got my attention. And now to put this in context, I believe he was referring to some of his fellow atheists who are also scientists who were disregarding the need for philosophy. And before we went live, I was telling you about one of my friends who's an atheist scientist. He's a biology professor at the local university here. And he and I are good friends. But whenever he and I get together and I start throwing some philosophical arguments at him, or whatever, he's just like, oh, well, that's philosophical flim flam. That's his words. Because we don't need philosophy. In fact, he's told me, and he's made this public, that his belief is that science is the only way to know. And I'm sure well, then the right response is, well, how do you know that? Did you learn that in the lab? And blah, blah, blah. And then he goes, that's philosophical flim flam once again, So now Dennett, being an atheist himself and one who takes science seriously, to folks like that, Dennett says this. He says, quote, I've got his quote here. It says, there is no such thing as philosophy-free science, just science that has been conducted without any consideration of its underlying philosophical assumptions. And so I say amen to that, Dan. I could not agree more. Now, I've taken Dennett's words and adapted them for my own purposes when dealing with my fellow Christians. And there's a lot of them who disregard philosophy, as some others have. Dennett was talking to atheistic scientists who have done that. Well, sadly, there's many Christians who disregard philosophy, and they bring up that Colossians 2:8 verse all the time. And then, so I take Dennett's words and I change them a bit, and I say, there is no such thing as philosophy-free theology, just theology that has been conducted without any consideration of its underlying philosophical assumptions. So with that said, I do take philosophy extremely seriously. I just try to avoid that shallow philosophy or incoherent thinking, which I think, you would agree that everybody ought to do. So with that said, my PhD, according to my diploma, it's not in philosophy. I have a master's degree in apologetics. Apologetics, which is, you can't do that apart from, it's filled with philosophy, but technically I'm not a philosopher there. And then my PhD is in theology. Now it is systematic theology, so it's got to be logically coherent. My goal as a systematic theologian is to make sure that my theological belief system is all coherent. I can't have one belief over here and another belief over here that don't fit. I need to make sure all the puzzle pieces fit. I've got to try my best to make everything fit. And so I take the coherence of theism quite seriously. And so that requires logic, which is part of philosophy. So you can't, as soon as we say that Christianity is true or that the Bible is true, what do you mean by truth? Well, now you start getting into the laws of logic, and then you see that truth and logic are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. So just the mere fact when somebody says that Christianity is true, well, then it seems that they are assuming the law of the excluded middle. When Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," okay, is that statement true or is it false? It's we're to logic now, and now we're into philosophy. So now with the coherence of theism in mind and systematic theology, if any part of my theological beliefs are mutually exclusive, or I see that they're contradicting each other, then I know that something's got to give, and I've got to change my mind about something. And with that said, I do have a rich history of changing my mind. I told that story of how I got into trying to see if Christianity was true, and along the way, I've changed my mind about so many things. My ultimate belief in Christian theism has grown stronger, but along the way, all these subcategories that were underneath that umbrella of Christian theism, as it were, so many of those things have changed. So probably the main thing that led to my doctoral dissertation in this book was I used to be an exhaustive determinist, or what I call an exhaustive divine determinist, and I abbreviate that as EDD, EDD. And that's easy to remember because Jonathan Edwards was really that kind of a guy. But I used to hold that view of exhaustive divine determinism. Everything that happens, God causally determines it. Every thought and belief that I have, God causally determines it. Every time I judge a proposition, well, God determined my judgment and my evaluation. So God causally determines everything on that view. And that's, so I was a Calvinist as well. But so with that said, as I started studying logic and philosophy and systematic theology, I tried to hold that view, that Ed view, as long as I could. In fact, I fought for it. I spent a year trying to disprove, like Dr. William Lane Craig's view of Molinism, trying to reconcile God's sovereignty and human freedom. I fought against that for over a year and studied it almost every day for a year, trying to disprove it. But ultimately, I realized that this view, that my view of Ed was logically unacceptable, and it contradicts other aspects of biblical theology and let alone perfect being theology. So now I spend most of my time arguing, not with atheists. I spend most of my time arguing with my brothers and sisters in Christ, with fellow Christians who hold to different views of God's sovereignty and human freedom or determinism. So I argue most of the time, it seems, with those who hold my previous view of Calvinism or exhaustive divine determinism. So, that's one thing I've changed my mind about. I've also changed my mind about, say, young earth creationism. When I started this journey, I was a young earth creationist. Now I think the universe is probably around 14 billion years old. And I also argue, and just finding out that you're a biology teacher, we should talk about this sometimes. But now, in fact, I touch on this in my final chapter of my book. I argue that evolution, even from a single-celled common ancestor, is compatible with Scripture, and I provide a model attempting to demonstrate that. And this has led to some fantastic conversations in the biology department at the local university here too. But I just love these conversations, and it's because I'm devoted to logic and philosophy that has allowed me to change my mind about so many things. And I mean, if Christians desire logical conclusions about what the Bible teaches, which allows them to say that the Bible is true. Like I said earlier, truth and logic are inextricably linked. So if that's the case, then what's bedrock, really? It's logic. And you see, hermeneutics, just like the scientific method, the historical method, even mathematics, and it all assumes logic. It all assumes that logic is bedrock and builds the rest of its discipline upon it. So that is to say that knowledge-based fields, they all presuppose logic and use logic. And this includes the theologian attempting to interpret the Bible correctly, which we call hermeneutics. Hermeneutics assumes the laws of logic. And so anyway, I've had Christians complain that I am putting logic ahead of the Bible. And so then the question is, at least a couple questions are raised. Well, why is it wrong to start with logic before interpreting the Bible? And how did you come to the conclusion that it's wrong to start with logic before interpreting the Bible? And, I've had these answers. One said, a couple different answers here. One of them said, well, my proper hermeneutic applied to the Bible assures me that the Bible teaches this to be the case. And the other person said, basically, I mean, didn't say these exact words, but basically this is what he said or implied. And he could say it like this: I'm making an extra biblical and non-logical assumption. Okay, well, look, according to the first answer, since he's appealing to hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is based on the bedrock of logic, then he's uttering gibberish by ultimately appealing to the bedrock of logic to reject the bedrock of logic. And this is nonsense, and actually affirms my point that logic is bedrock. And then the second answer, if he says I'm making an extra biblical non-logical assumption, well, then why should anybody take him seriously? It's not even from Scripture, which he says he's standing on. So all that to say, I probably went on a tirade there, but all of that is to say that logic is bedrock. I take that seriously. Philosophy is something that all Christians ought to take very seriously. But it's sad that not all, I would say that most Christians don't have their feet wet philosophically. I didn't, and I was a pastor, and that's horrible. I mean, if anybody, all pastors should, that's for sure. But look, and you made note of this. I contend that Christ followers ought to be at least trying to be the best logicians and philosophers in the world. That should be the goal. And we do have a rich history in the past few centuries of some awesome philosophers, and as you said, even some really good philosophers today. So the sad thing is today that seems to be a small percentage of Christianity at large.
I wouldn't be so pessimistic. I mean, in the sense that, yeah, I think that the Christian community could get better with respect to engaging with philosophy. I have to say that the scientific community has dropped the ball as well. Okay, I really think they have. And so it's not just Christians. And I think this is just a general. I mean, like there are certain people that I've noticed, like mathematicians. If you talk to mathematicians about philosophy and logic, they're just like right there with you usually. Like they start. They don't really start at the same place where like some kind of like biologist or chemist starts, right? They start more abstractly. And after all, you had people like Frege who thought that math and logic were like basically the same thing, that math was reducible to logic. And so, but you have a lot of the scientific community that's kind of having this. If Christianity has an issue community-wise, I'm telling you, it's everywhere else in other domains, right? So it's a general thing for me. Nothing specific to one specific group. I think people would definitely benefit from philosophy. I think one time I heard Craig say something like, "Look, if you're a mathematician, you should do a little bit of philosophy of math. If you're a scientist, do a little bit of philosophy of science. If you study linguistics, you got to do a little philosophy of language, right? This is if you're a Christian, you got to do a little philosophy of religion, right?" And so I'm right there with you, and I think that everyone should be right there with you. But when it comes to one of the tendencies that I've realized is that when someone, especially an atheist or a Christian, first encounters these arguments, right? They want to take their arguments, and I'm so guilty of this, and use it as a weapon, like a bludgeon, right? We feel like we've got this power that the peons don't have, right? And we just want to hammer people with it, right? And so how do you think how should Christian disagreement be with non-believers? Do you think that what sort of approach would you take? I mean, because we discussed before that like it can be, if on Christianity, right, there's salvation at stake potentially, right? And so it's hard to ignore that in these dialogues. If you're debating about the existence of numbers, that's one thing. Right? I love those conversations. Those are actually very meaningful conversations. The existence of God does have an impact on society and on the self in a way where the numbers don't, right? So I wanted to ask about how should Christians approach non-believers once they've gotten the sort of knowledge or these sorts of arguments that you can get from these for other in philosophy.
I got to tell you, when I first started studying apologetics at Biola, and as I was learning from William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland and these different guys, and at first I went on a journey. It was kind of a roller coaster ride. At first I'm getting all these awesome arguments. Then you start studying all the counter arguments, and that kind of rocked me again. Then you find the counters to those, and then you start getting excited again. Anyway, when I first started, and probably even after I first graduated, they always tell you, don't use apologetics as a weapon. Paul talks about destroying arguments raised against the knowledge of God in 2 Corinthians 10:5. But I'll never forget one of my professors saying, but don't destroy the arguer. Destroy their arguments while you love the arguer. And you said, because salvation is on the line, well, why do you want the other person to believe like you do? Ultimately, is it to make you feel better, or is it because you love that person and you desire the best for them? And so really, if you love that person, if you're a Christ follower and you believe that the purpose of life, the reason why we exist, is to love God and love others, everybody from your neighbors to your enemies. If you really love that person, then you will not use apologetics as a weapon. Now, there's times when I have used apologetics as a weapon, when I let when I get frustrated, maybe with there's an atheist troll who's really just trying to get my goat online or whatever.
When you get a bad interlocutor, a dishonest interlocutor, you really want to cover them.
Right. Well, yeah, I would say that's my emotions that, I'm like, okay, you want to be like that? I mean, so I used to be an MMA coach, and I fought a little bit, but that martial artist past can bubble up very quickly. I'm like, oh, you want to go? Okay, let's fight. And that's not right, though. That is not what Jesus wants us to do. He wants you to love. He wants you to speak the truth and love. So now look, it's not just Christians that do that. I mean, I know, some people are like, oh, you're just an apologist. Well, anytime you think a view is true, and then you offer reasons or arguments as to why you think that view is true, then you're an apologist. Apologetics is just from the Greek word apologia, which just means to provide a reason or to provide a defense for something. And so there's atheist apologists, there's Christian apologists, there's Muslim apologists. As soon as you start saying, no, my view is true because of X, Y, and Z, now you're an apologist, or at least that's how I see it. But Christians do have a tendency, once they first they jump into these apologetics waters, to start, launching their torpedoes in these waters and to win fights. And really, that's why I got into it in the first place, is because I was so mad at the people that were coming after the kids in my youth group. I wanted to fight them. Right. But as I started studying it and really studying the theology behind it, I realized, man, I am called to love my interlocutor, not fight them. And so my heart started to change on that. And so I don't look to, I know that I have a tendency, I have my flesh oftentimes will want to fight, but that's not usually right. But so, how should Christians approach apologetics and these kinds of things? I say that Christians should have their feet wet in the waters of apologetics. By that, I mean, not looking to go out and start a fight, but simply knowing some reasons as to why you think your faith is true, why you think Christianity is true. When I first got into it, I thought everybody needed to get into it. I dove into the waters and I thought, hey, everybody jump into these deep waters with me. But I realized, it didn't take long to realize, especially when my wife and son started pushing back a little bit, like, hey, we don't want to be deep sea divers. We're fine in the baby pool. So I'm like, all right, that's cool. But some are wired to dive into those deep waters. But nevertheless, the Bible does seem to tell Christ followers that we ought to know some good reasons, and reasons that we can share with others about why we have that hope within us. And so I'm sure you're aware of 2 Peter 3:15. It says, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you, yet do this with gentleness and respect. And so with that said, Christians ought to know some of these reasons, but I don't think that all Christ followers are called to be the next William Lane Craig or even to do apologetics like I do. But I think all Christians need to get their feet wet. And I would say the same thing for atheists, and you do this, you have reasons for why you think atheism is true. Well, then you share these with each other. And when we can do that in a gentle and respectful way with each other, when we're both loving each other, we're both working toward truth together, and we both think we have truth. But when we're both working together in a gentle and respectful way, it's fun. And I always say then you're in a win-win situation, because I was joking with somebody the other day. They said, well, Tim, you never lose this was in regards to debating Calvinists. But somebody said, well, Tim, you never lose a theological debate. And I said, well, I never lose a debate. He said, you never lose a debate, because even if you do, you've got martial arts and you can always, kick him in the face and win that way or whatever. And I said, no, look, I never lose a debate, because I either win and prove my point or I change my mind. And if you're dedicated to truth, no matter what, then you're always in a win-win situation. So I actually love changing my mind if I find good reason to do so. So anyway, a lot of people, especially when they first get into apologetics and interacting with non-believers, don't understand that. I didn't when I first got into it, but my heart has been changed in that process. Bottom line, always doing it with gentleness and respect. I fail. I know I fail at that. I don't do the always, but that's the goal. And I know that that's what I'm shooting for. But really, truth and love, gentleness and grace, giving reasons and arguments with gentleness and respect. Those kinds of things aren't mutually exclusive. You can have 100% of love and 100% of truth. They're not like, do I have 50% of each or 60-40 of each or 70-30? No, you can have 100% of both. They're not mutually exclusive. I don't see how they are anyway. And so that's the goal and the target that we're called to hit: truth with grace, love, or truth with grace and love, and reasons with gentleness and respect. And like I said, I'm not perfect at it, but that's the goal. And I've seen it work. So I don't know. What do you think?
First of all, there's people that you see, I used to be a Christian. For those that don't know me, a lot of people in the chat do know me. I used to be a Christian. And when I see these these stories about people coming out of Christianity, a lot of them are like really point to Christianity and say that like it was harmful, there could be some that are, kind of reluctant to leave Christianity. Maybe they didn't know how to respond to a particular argument, and they just find themselves at a crossroads and either become an agnostic, and they're just kind of reluctant and they miss Christianity. But I have to say that like Christianity, especially Christian apologetics. Now, I don't thank Christian apologetics for the deconversion. That's not what I'm saying. I think Christian apologetics and as a way of learning how to think, learning, actually learning the difference between an argument and a claim, right? I think they're just really useful tools in a Christian apologetics, and namely, I'm very thankful for it because it helped me discover what I'm interested in academically, right? Yeah. The philosophy is a domain that's not really given in K through 12, not very often, right?
Oh, that's horrible.
So I teach both biology and philosophy, and my students that are exposed to, let's say, what a fallacy, like I might give them a fallacy of the fallacy of like a emotional appeal, appeal to emotion. And I give them an example, or like the textbook example is something like, you better eat your food because, there's all these starving people in some other an undeveloped country. And they immediately empathize with that. And then, oh my gosh, that's a kind of fallacy, blah, blah, blah. And then I say, well, you should still listen to your parents, right? They're just trying to motivate you to eat, that's it. But technically, if they were saying that it necessarily follows that we feel bad for these people, that therefore we should eat, that's going to be a fallacy. But so they learn just the basics of what a fallacy is, and they're just engrossed in the material, something they've never encountered before.
Yeah.
And I think that you can get that in apologetics, because you won't get that in the school system.
No.
Right.
No.
And
do you
so
teach at a public school or a private school?
Yeah, public school. Yeah, I teach at a public school. I had to work a lot to get one class of not politics, of Christianity, right? Wow, I'm sorry. I heard noise and I got distracted. Of Intro to Philosophy. I offer Intro to Philosophy. And so it took a lot of work to offer that elective at my public school. But I think that apologetics is another way of introducing the sorts of the material that you would see in a college level course, right? And that will prepare you for whatever, right?
Yeah.
But let's get into the meat of it, right?
Okay.
One of the most difficult questions, right, is who is God, right? And the way that a philosopher might approach to what a thing is, or what a mind is, or a particular mind is, they talk about the properties of that thing or that object, or in this case, a subject, right? And so there are lots of them. People think that it's just about all-knowing, omniscience, and maybe two other omnis, but there's other weird properties that they may have not heard about God. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think the properties of God are?
Yeah, like you said, there's several that we've got to consider, like aseity and simplicity. Some others that I don't think are necessary, but which sounds weird, but like omnipresence, I don't think is a necessary property of God. But I'll explain. It's really talking about what is God like. So I think of God's properties as a way of describing objective facts about God. And so I typically like to look at three. This is what I refer to as the big three. I spill a lot of ink on this in my book. But the big three are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. So omniscience, or let's start with omnipotence. Omnipotence means that you got to define these things carefully too, right? So omnipotence is God can do all things logically possible. So when somebody says, oh, well, can he create a married bachelor? Well, a married bachelor is logically impossible. God can do all things logically possible. Let me jump to the next one now. Omniscience. God is all-knowing, is what that one means. So I define that as God knows the truth value to all well-defined propositions, or all clear and well-defined propositions. Then the next one is omnibenevolence, and I define that as God loves and desires the best for all people. And so now sometimes atheists will, like with the problem of evil, they'll say, okay, Christianity, look, you can't logically affirm all of these. And if you're going to say that God's omnipotent, then he can save everybody. And if you're going to say that God's omniscient, then he knows how to use his power to get everybody that irresistible grace so that everybody's saved. And if he's omnibenevolent, then he would want to save everybody. But look, you've got this thing called hell. And so not everybody is saved. So which one isn't he? Is he not omnipotent? Is he not omniscient? Is he not omnibenevolent? Pick one or all three. But man, as soon as you start saying that God's not one of these three, now God's no longer a maximally great being. And isn't that the definition of God? Well, if God's not a maximally great being, and that's the definition of God, well, now God doesn't even exist. The arguments are different. There's many different forms of the problem of evil. That's one of them. And now I take that, and I think there's some truth, as it were, to this approach anyway. And I use this, and
like
I say,
there's a prima facie problem, like an at-a-glance problem, maybe, is what you might say.
Well, right. Now, I do think that many Christians have this problem. And I spend a lot of time in this book showing that most Christians have a real problem with that argument, and that there's only a few Christians who can actually provide a good answer, a good response to it. And I think that's the Christians who are known as Molinists. That doesn't mean the other Christians aren't really Christians or anything like that. It means that their systematic theology has some holes in it. Maybe they can't connect all the dots logically.
Okay, so there's Molinism. Can you offer the other alternatives to Molinism that a Christian might be if they take a view?
Yeah. So the other views would be Calvinism. Now there's different forms of Calvinism. I really go after what I used to be. So the view that's in my sights, as it were, is exhaustive divine determinism. Now I do go after 5-point Calvinism as well, which a 5-point Calvinist does not have to be an exhaustive divine determinist. There's apologists and theologians out there. Do you know who Greg Kokel is?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, he's a stand to reason. He's a really good apologist. 5-point Calvinist, though, so we disagree on that. But he also affirms that humans have libertarian free will, which most Calvinists don't. So anyway, I'm getting on a rabbit trail here, but I go after exhaustive divine determinism and Calvinism. I think they all have, both of those actually have problems with this argument, the problem of evil argument, different versions of it. I think the Arminian who holds to the simple foreknowledge view is going to have some problems, not as many, but some. And then the open theist, I think, is going to have some problems, not as many, but they're going to have some too. I think the Molinist view definitely provides the best explanation of the competing hypotheses here. But so I discuss the big three of God's omni attributes in my book, and I specifically show how some views of Christianity, the list that I've just given you, that they cannot logically affirm all three of God's omni attributes simultaneously. So now, of course, almost every Christian is going to assert all three, right? You said there's a difference between a claim and an argument, right? Almost everybody's going to claim it and assert these things and even affirm, no, this is what our view holds. But then I, like the atheist, will come along and say, well, look, this is what you're saying, and compare that to this statement here, and this doesn't seem to work. So I'll say that Calvinists cannot affirm God's omnibenevolence. And in fact, in my book, I quote Arthur Pink, a Reformed theologian and a Calvinist who makes it clear, because I think he's looking at the data here, and he's like, well, God does not love all people, right? That's a quote. God does not love all people. That's what the Calvinist is left with. And I think I just saw Jerry Walls, another philosopher, used to teach at Notre Dame. Now he's at Houston Baptist University, but he does a lot of work trying to show why Calvinism is wrong. And I just saw him post something on Facebook in the last day or two, saying that I think he was looking at all of John Calvin's, is referencing to other scriptures. And I think he said he couldn't find one mention of 1 John 4:8 that says God is love. And so he's like, not one mention. So I haven't looked into that myself. I just saw that on Facebook, but it's from a trusted source, so I'll have to look into that. But I've reached that same conclusion about the Calvinists, that they are going to have problems, logical problems, affirming God's omnibenevolence. Now, John Piper, I think to his credit, sees, okay, we got a problem here. I've got to deal with this now. And I deal with him now in my book. I interact with him.
Now, John Piper is a Calvinist. Is that what
right?
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yep. He sees, okay, we can't say that God doesn't love all people, right? Because God is love, right? And the Bible seems to be clear. If there's anything we can know about the God that Jesus revealed, that God loves everybody, and that's why we exist, is to love God and love people. And so with that said, I think Piper tries to save his Calvinism. I don't think he's successful. I think he still has a love problem. But the way he tries to fix his problem is he winds up denying, it seems to me, that he denies God's omnipotence. And so, okay, well, all right, so much for a maximally great being. All right, we got problems here. Now, open theists and simple foreknowledge folks must deny a full view of God's omniscience now. So now we've got problems, maximally great being problems
I
there.
want to make sure the viewers understand. So open theism, they just reject omniscience flat out? I mean, or do they think that knowing future contingent facts is impossible? Is that the view?
Yeah, to be fair, that would be the view. I mean, I think you could probably find open theists who would claim, who would affirm, but if you're going to steel man the argument, you would say they would hold that future free actions or counterfactuals of creaturely freedom aren't logically knowable. And so I get into that and interact with that in my book as well. But I say, well, look, God's still not. What would be greater? A God who doesn't? I mean, it's not like saying God can create a bachelor who's married, right? Once the terms are defined, or once the terms are defined, a married bachelor is not logically coherent. Once the terms are defined, you see that God cannot create a triangle with four corners. And there doesn't seem to me to be any analytical, logical problem with God knows the future free actions of free creatures, or God knows the CCFs, the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, logically prior to creation, or something like that. So it's not the same thing as saying God can create a married bachelor. So anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail right now.
For the Arminian, so I always have a hard time defining or giving what an Arminian believes. So if you could help us out with that, that'd be great.
You bet. So an Arminian, well, I actually think, and I discussed this in my book, I'm going to say that a lot today probably, but I think Arminius, Euquibus Arminius, was probably an in-the-closet Molinist. But you see, he's a reformer. So at one point, according to Tom McCall, who's Arminius historian and theologian, I had a conversation with him on this back when I was first starting my studies here, trying to figure out all these views. And he told me that Arminius was once accused of being too Catholic by the reformers. And it was so political back then. But he worked hard to get back in good standing with the reformers. But now as he's working on stuff, he could not. McCall thinks that Arminius was a Molinist. He's quoting Molina without referencing him, without footnoting him or citing him. Well, so is he guilty of plagiarism? Well, you see, he couldn't do it because as soon as he starts quoting a Catholic Jesuit monk, he's going to be ousted from the reformers, and he wants to stay in the reformers. This is the way I understand it. So he believes that Arminius actually was a Molinist, and he quotes Molina a couple times. Now, Molina is a Spanish Jesuit monk, right? Spanish, so he's from Spain, and Arminius he actually quotes him. They found his books in his library, so there's not much of a debate there. But the big question now is, did Arminius understand Molina? He does, I think, reference middle knowledge, which is central to Molina's theology and philosophy here. But now my colleague Kirk McGregor, who I think is one of the leading Molinist scholars in the world today, does not think that Arminius was a Molinist. He does not think he understood it enough to be called a Molinist. So anyway, there's a debate among scholars here if Arminius was a Molinist or not. I'm open to him being an in-the-closet Molinist, as it were. Now, the Arminians, however, I don't think they understood what Arminius was trying to teach them. And so then as they go on, and as they are interacting with the Synod of Dort, which is a huge political mess. And this is where we get 5-point Calvinism from, the tulip, as it were. And Molinism is not even on the radar screen here. I don't think middle knowledge is ever brought up. And so I just think, man, if Molina would have been alive to defend his views during Dort, things would be way different today. But I'm kind of glad it didn't go down that way, because that leaves so much room to have so many fun conversations like this. Anyway, an Arminian can affirm Molinism, and I think they should. But there's some who, I'm trying to think of one professor in particular. What's his name? He's a friend of mine, and I can't think of it. It'll come to me later. But he would be an Arminian who holds to the simple foreknowledge view and only foreknowledge, not middle knowledge. And if there's no middle knowledge, there's no Molinism. And middle knowledge is simply God's knowledge of, roughly God's knowledge of how free creatures would freely choose if he were to create free creatures, and even if he never did. So that's rough. But then some will say that God can't know that stuff. So that's where the debate's at. But just very quickly, well, I guess I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Before we continue, someone was interested. So you already got someone to to pay for get your book or purchase your book. But they're wondering, where is Amazon a good source?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yeah, so Amazon's it's only $9.99 on Kindle.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and in your book, do you distinguish these views, or do you just kind of go over other issues with respect to human freedom and divine foreknowledge?
Yeah.
Like, well, I read about Calvinism and Arminianism. Okay,
yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
A whole chapter is devoted to Calvin. A whole chapter is devoted to Arminius. A whole chapter is devoted to Molina. In fact, I'd say close to half the book is devoted to a historical survey from everybody from Augustine to Aquinas to Luther and Calvin to Arminius to the Synod of Dort to Jonathan Edwards, then to Molina. And then I shift from history to philosophical arguments, to theological arguments and biblical arguments, and then ultimately get us into apologetics. So, but yeah, I do interact with the open theists' claims and objections. I'd say if I had a main target, though, I'm going after exhaustive divine determinism and Calvinism in general.
Yeah, you don't really hear. I don't meet a lot of open theists, and I think the average Christian might just have like a simple, like the simple foreknowledge, or how did you refer it? It seems like that's like almost like the default view, right? People don't think in terms of middle knowledge when they think about God's knowledge.
Yeah, here's an easy way to remember it. I talk about God knows all that could, would, and will. So could, would, and will, and these modal concepts are different here. So I say that logically prior to creation, a maximally great being who's omnipotent and omniscient would know everything that he could do, everything that God could make actual, right? So if a maximally great being exists, which is, I take it to be the definition of God, maximally great being. If a maximally great being exists, he's omnipotent. So he's got the power to do all kinds of things. And if he's omniscient, he knows exactly what he could do. And surely he doesn't do everything he could do. So God has the knowledge of everything he could accomplish. Given that he's omniscient, logically prior to creation, he also knows everything that would happen based on everything he could do. So the question is raised, does God have the power, does an omnipotent God have the power to create a libertarian free creature? That is a creature that he does not always causally determine. Well, that seems to be pretty clear. Yeah, an omnipotent God would create the power, or would have the power to create a free being in the libertarian sense. And so then, if he is omniscient prior to creation, he would also know how that free creature would freely choose if he were to create a creature in a freedom permitting circumstance, if he creates that creature or not. So you could be a determinist, a divine determinist, and say, well, yeah, God does have the power to create a free creature, and God does know how that free creature would freely choose if he were to create him, but he never did. Okay, well, that's great. Now you've still got middle knowledge there. So middle knowledge is God's knowledge of the would. So natural knowledge is God's knowledge of the could. Middle knowledge is of the would. Then God creates. So now we've got what's called the creative decree, or, let there be, boom. And now God knows everything that will happen, and that includes everything that will freely happen. And what will happen is known as God's free knowledge, and that's also simple foreknowledge. If God only knows what will happen, but he doesn't know the would prior to creation, then it's just the simple foreknowledge approach. But I don't see how you get any sovereignty over simply knowing what will happen. Big deal. I think you need the middle knowledge to get sovereignty there. But anyway, I digress.
All right. So there's a big question about what to do here in terms of determining. Let's say I'm a Christian and I'm looking at these four views, right? So some people, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the role in philosophy and Christianity, but some people will say, okay, how am I a free creature? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And they wonder whether it's an exegetical question or whether it's a philosophical question, because sometimes we come to conclusions philosophically, and then, you know, a Christian might say, how does this mesh with what I'm reading? And then other times it could go in the reverse, right? Where like, okay, this seems very clear, a clear truth, biblically speaking. And so now how do I revise my metaphysical assumptions? Okay. So when you're asking a question, do I have free will? Okay. Or is God omniscient? Do you take a hybrid stance? And that's to say, is it, the view not only has to cohere philosophically and logically, but it also has to cohere with what the text is saying? Or does there a particular approach kind of overpower the other approach? Do you see what I'm saying? Basically, is it an exegetical question when we ask, do human beings have free will? Or is it something more than just an exegetical question?
Great question. So I think it can be done exegetically, and it also can be done philosophically. But I think it ought to be both. It's a both and as far as I'm concerned. And in fact, in my book, chapter 12 is focused on that philosophical task of demonstrating that humans possess libertarian free will, or simply libertarian freedom. And then chapter 13, I make a shift and I argue for it theologically, or I should say based on scripture and then based upon perfect being theology. So for the Christian, I try to provide multiple reasons. But really, I think, just talking to you prior to recording, I think your view would allow you to affirm at least most of my philosophical arguments for libertarian freedom. So just let me ask you, what do you hold? Are you a determinist, or do you think
I'm a compatibilist? But I borrow from one thing that compatibilist. So the normal sense of compatibilism is unsatisfactory to me, right? So if you talk if you talk to the average compatibilist in some philosophy department, it's not my view, most likely.
Okay, good.
I think that the libertarians get it half right. Okay. So here's where they get it right, that the future is open. Okay.
Well, that's the open theist view.
Well, but open in the sense that, so I think you could still, on my view, God could still know the future, and the future. Here's what I mean by the openness of the future. It's confusing because there's like theological terms I'm using here. Right. So the idea is this: that let's say my mental state causes some behavior. Okay. Where I think freedom lies is that I can't further explain that in terms of a natural law, right? When I desire to drink water, or I desire to drink a Dr. Pepper, and I grab the Dr. Pepper, that mental state causes a physical state. Okay, there you go. That mental state causes a physical state, and it's not further understood in terms of a natural law. Okay, but that's the determinist picture, just what I've given you, right? That what caused my behavior? Well, my mental state, and it was my mental state, and that's why there's a sense of will there, right? Now then, the libertarian is going to say, well, what caused that mental state? Right now, if that mental state was caused by some other non-mental state, let's say your brain, okay, or some environmental factor, that's going to undermine freedom for them, right? So they want to say something like there's a self that causes the mental state. So there's the origin of that mental state comes from me, and there's no further explanation for that, okay? And then that causes the behavior. And in the sense that not only did I cause the behavior with my mental state, but that there's no further explanation for my mental state other than the fact that it came from myself, that's where freedom lies, right? There's no antecedent conditions that determine that mental condition, okay? And so we could have a debate about that right there, where I think that on my view, I'll just give you my conclusion. I won't give you my argument because I'm interested in some other stuff. Is that undermines freedom because I think it's indistinguishable from randomness. Okay, the idea that a kind of state, let's say a mental state, just being uncaused, right, or no further explanation for why it comes about. So the idea. So I didn't explain this well. So I have the self here, so it causes a desire. Let's say to do A. Libertarians want to say that if I could have caused not A, or a desire to not do A. Okay. But on my view, I think there's a problem here in there not being a contrastive explanation for why I do one over the other. There's an explanation for why I desire, namely the self, but is there an explanation for why I do A rather than not A? Okay. And this is essentially called the randomness objection to libertarian will, right? Yeah. And so now, if there are people that say, look, a libertarian free action is nearly indistinguishable from a random action, so what, right? That's what I mean by free will. And so, and to me, I'm just saying, well, I'm trying to capture something different by my terms, but
I think our views are very similar. In my book, I say, well, I can affirm a compatibilism of sorts too, but it's not the way compatibilism is traditionally defined, or what it's so the way compatibilism is defined today is typically the thesis that free will and or moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. So as soon as somebody says, I think compatibilism explains reality, what you're saying is that you think that determinism is true.
I do affirm determinism. Now, look.
Let me ask you this: do you think everything about you is causally determined by something else?
Well, some of my mental states are caused by my own mental states, right?
And are those ultimately those mental states caused by something or something else?
Right. So ultimately, there are some mental states that I am not responsible for.
Are there any mental states that you are responsible for that were not causally determined by something or someone else?
No. So if you're saying something like, let's say I look at a cake. So my account is something like this. I look at a cake and I find it desirable and I form a desire to eat it. I'm going to, that to me, that's a deterministic.
Right. I think compatibilism combined with determinism can describe that kind of thing. Okay. I don't want to take this down interviewing you.
Let's just start with what we agree on. Here's what we agree. Okay. That if there's some further explanation for other than my desire to eat the cake, like some natural law, well, then it's not really the desire that explains me eating the cake. It's the natural laws, right? And that's where I think we do agree on, right? That if there's on my view and on your view, there is some sense in which we can privilege a mental state as being some causally relevant to a behavior, but on a naturalistic form of compatibilism, no, and that's not. There's a further explanation, right? The natural laws, and I am not myself. My mind doesn't possess those natural laws themselves. That's something external to myself. So in every case, no matter what, when I desire, well, no, that's just further explained in terms of natural laws, ultimately speaking, and so I've become a kind of mechanism, right? But
right. So I think you and I can really find a lot of common ground here. So maybe I should talk about some of the arguments that I offer, because I think that I don't think that moral or rational responsibility is compatible with something or someone else causally determining all of my thoughts or beliefs or judgments or evaluations. If somebody states a proposition, and then I'm going to evaluate that proposition as either true or false, or good, bad, better, the best, true. There's a bunch of different evaluative judgment options that seem to be on the table. But if somebody says, proposition X, and now I get to judge or evaluate that. But if something else other than the self, right, other than the thing I refer to as I, if there's something else that causally determines that judgment for me, then I don't have metaphysical access to all these other evaluative judgment options. And so therefore I'm not in an epistemic position to know if I should have had access to these other options. Now I think this is, so when I'm talking to the Calvinist who says that God causally determines all of my thoughts and beliefs and judgments and evaluations, I say, okay, well, look, I don't have reason then to believe. I don't have reason to think that my cognitive faculties or that just my beliefs are reliable. And they'll say, oh, but God's doing it. I'm like, yeah, but according to your view, God even causally determines when you happily affirm a false belief, let alone everybody else. Every affirmed false belief is not your fault. It was causally determined by God. And so if God, so not only does that make God like Loki from the Avengers, a god of mischief or a deity of deception, I think Stephen Law, who you've had on here, I think he would agree to this, right? This isn't a maximally great being. This is a deity of deception, definitely not worthy of worship. So I reject that view. It can't be true. But I think you also have problems saying, okay, if just a mechanism that is irrational, not rational or irrational, but just irrational, is causally determining all my thoughts and beliefs, evaluations, and judgments, I'm going to have problems. So I think there's got to be something about humanity that I call the self. People can call it whatever they want, but something that is not ultimately always causally determined by something or someone else. And I think substance, I think, dualism in general, I think can answer that. But I am a substance dualist. You're a dualist, but a different kind of dualist. Yeah, but I think you have, right? Yeah, I think you still have access, and we'll have to unpack this maybe in a different conversation. But I think you still have access to what I'm trying to argue for here.
Saying is something like what I said about natural laws, right? Where I have a problem is if my desire and then my behavior, right? I have a desire and behavior. I want to say my desire explains this behavior, but then the scientist says, no. There's natural laws that explain the desire, and you're saying that could happen on a divine level, right? Where if you're a Christian and you affirm to something like Calvinism, right, that you have a desire, you have a behavior. Well, no, there's a further explanation, right? That God is kind of caused you to have that desire in a direct sense,
right?
And so that actually explains your behavior, not your desire. It's really God up there,
right,
doing the same thing as natural laws, right?
And I don't see where responsibility comes into play there. It doesn't seem like I should be, so if that's true, then anybody, if that view of theism is true and God causally determines everybody's unbelief, I think I think that then the problem of evil is a real problem. The problem of damnation is a big problem here, because how can these people rationally be held as liable or accountable, that they ought to be punished for something that God made them believe in the first place? It doesn't make sense to me. And so as a Christian, I reject that view, even though many Christians hold it. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not. If I were to be a Christian, I would probably hold to something like open theism, and then But Molinism, it's clever. It's very clever. It definitely gets around the objection that I hear so many times on the internet, that if God knows you will do X, then necessarily you will do X. That's a modal scope fallacy. But then there's like a further question of like, okay, so then how do we analyze God's knowledge and our free will? Well, I think modalism does provide a very clever response.
Mm-hmm.
But there are Christians, so there are people on your side that are not Calvinist, right? And that are not Molinist either. So Dr. Trent Dougherty, I think he was at Baylor until 2018. Okay, brilliant philosopher, knows his theology. And there's a couple I'm in the description after the stream. I will put some links to his material. He quote, he despises Molinism, right? And I've never heard a Christian say that, right? Because most Christians are not familiar with Molinism, right?
Yeah.
And the ones that are familiar with Molinism find it very clever, like I do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, where is this coming from, right? Here we have a Christian that's not a Calvinist, right? That despises Molinism, and so Dougherty.
What is his view?
He thinks that that the problem of evil becomes worse. Okay, so he actually disagrees. You think that the Molinism can circumvent the problem of evil, but he thinks that there's a lot of weird philosophy here, but basically, I'll try to use these terms. Molinists like to distinguish between influence and cause.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the fancy terms for this, according to I think Flint and Fredroso, they wrote a paper called Maximal Power. Okay. And they distinguish between weak actualization and strong actualization. So to depict it is something like if you were asking me, Danny, what kind of car should I buy? And I say, buy a Honda Civic, very efficient car. Okay. And then that serves as a reason, and you go and buy that Honda Civic. Who caused the purchase of the Honda Civic? Well, the Molinist will say, I didn't cause it. You caused it. But what role did I play then? I obviously played a role. So they would say, well, you weakly actualized it. You influenced him, right? But you didn't cause him to do it, okay? So Dougherty and others think that, well, okay, let's just use this word influence. Why couldn't God influence the world in a way where all these ills of society and sin weren't in place? So they think that, okay, we'll just use this notion of weak actualization and influence, and we'll just repeat the problem of evil, but instead of using cause, we'll just use the word influence. Okay, so that's Dougherty's objection, more or less. Those weren't his exact words. The only thing I've actually quoted him on was that he does not like it. But like I said, I will link the video that I saw to the description of the video, and y'all can hear him really kind of give it more in a robust, systematic way.
So what is his view, though? Is he an Arminian or an open theist? Or
you know what? That's a good question. I wish I knew. I can't. I tried to find a website or something, but I ran out of time. It was something that I wanted to know. I don't think he's an open theist, though, so I really don't know what's going on there. But
I mean, it seems like you're only left with so many options.
Right, yeah.
And I'm aware of him, but I've never interacted with him, and I don't know of his objection. But yeah, I mean, as soon as anybody, I've got a teenage son, and anybody who's trying to raise a teenager knows the difference between influence and causal determinism. When they're younger, I can causally determine many things about him. And causally determine what he's going to do. Now he's a senior in high school, and I'm trying to give him more and more freedom to prepare him for adulthood, to make his own decisions, because I can't make those for him anymore, and I can't force things upon him. But I'm giving him more and more freedom, letting him make more and more mistakes, but I still try to influence him all I can. But at the end of the day, I need to let him make his own mistakes. And so I can see anybody who's parented a teenager should know the difference between, because you've parented them in their younger years too, where you causally determine everything about them for so long. And then you understand the difference between mere influence and even much influence, and even then backing your influence off as they get older and older. And right before graduation, you're backing it way off. But the influence is still there because you love them, right? The influence is still there, but I am definitely, I mean, he just went to state as a Class A wrestler. It's really hard for me now to causally determine it. If he wanted to, he could just throw me around. So I don't think I could causally determine much, but I can still influence him, and I try. But ultimately, at the end of the day, he's free, and free to learn even from his own mistakes, free to learn from different kinds of choices. So I don't see that. I'll have to unpack his premises and see see if his argument is the structure and that is good, and the premises are sound. But just the way
I'll put his Twitter, and he's usually accessible. So he appears on YouTube. So maybe this would be a good thing to maybe talk to him about. Maybe we could discuss it. And that'd be a cool conversation. But I will level with you that there is something different there between influence and cause in terms of intuitive. The words make sense there. I didn't cause you to make that purchase, right? It seems like that. I wouldn't consider myself responsible for that purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I had something to play, I had a role to play in it. Okay. And the question is, how do we cash that out? And I think that, I think it would be, I would agree that it's false that I'd be responsible for the purchase. I think I would agree with you there.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has to be a different account, that I don't think an atheist, for instance, could say that if God influenced you in such a way where you formed a desire to do X, and then you desire X and do X, right? That God is responsible for X, right? You're responsible for X.
Yeah.
Okay. So that the conversation becomes about what that means and how do we cash out what God did there. And so I'm leveling with you on that on some kind of distinction there. We don't want to say that they're both equally responsible there. That doesn't seem, that would defeat a lot of our criminal justice proceedings and other things that violate our intuitions and stuff. So I'm right there with you.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you wanted to reply to that, or if you wanted to move on to a question. If there's any questions in the chat, I want everyone to start asking questions, because we're at least we said we would go for an hour and 30 minutes, and maybe right before Dr. Stratton needs to go, he'll cue in for he'll tell us maybe a question or two left, and then we got to end it. But so start asking your questions. I think there are 15 people watching, so those 15, please ask questions while you want to respond to any of what I said.
Well, bringing up so you said that Trent Dougherty's objection to Molinism is that it makes, did you say that it makes one more susceptible?
He thinks it makes the problem, because this is how he said, now I can quote him here.
Mm-hmm.
He says this: God gets the world he wants.
Okay. So let's talk about this.
Okay.
I do think that God got the world he wants. Now, could he have a world with no pain, evil, and suffering, no, where everybody's nice and loves, or I should say where nobody treats anybody bad anytime, could God do that? He could causally determine that and make it happen. But that's not what he wants. He wants a world of love. God is love, after all, 1 John 4:8. And so he desires to create creatures who can have a true love relationship with him. As I argue in my book, for true love to be possible, remember, since God can't do the logically impossible, he's got to create creatures with libertarian freedom to reject God's love and commands or not. And I believe that God wanted a world full of love, and because of that, he created a world full of libertarianly free creatures who were then free to make mistakes. Now, I want my son to never make mistakes, right? I want him to live a good life and to not sin. And not do the things that most rebellious teenagers do. Don't want him to make the same kinds of sins and mistakes that I did when I was a teenager. So I influence him. I tell him how things ought to be, how he ought to choose, and then I give him freedom. And guess what? He's not perfect, and he makes a lot of mistakes. But I still give him freedom in that, and let him learn. And hopefully, as I did, I started learning from all of my free mistakes. Now, I think that that's ultimately going to lead to the best of all scenarios. So anyway, I don't know how Trent reaches his conclusion, but I think the opposite is true. In fact, in my book, I make the case that Molinism is the only view of God's sovereignty that can adequately handle all the problems of evil, from the problem of moral evil. That's easy for the Molinist, hard for the Calvinist, and I think for others too. But we can easily handle the problems of evil. We just look at Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. I think we can handle the problems of natural evil. I think Molinism does the best job of that by far. I think we can handle the problems of what seem to be gratuitous evils. I think we can handle the problem of divine hiddenness. And so I discuss all this in the last chapter of my book. And so at least once all the relevant data has been factored into the equation, I think we could, the Molinist definitely has the best response to this. So here, one of the arguments that I offer in my book, it's here it goes like this. I can find it here.
And while you're looking for that, we'll wrap up with that, because what's not fair here is that you actually haven't heard Dougherty give his argument, and I'm probably characterizing it too simplistically. I gave you the two quotes, but maybe we could rendezvous at another time and maybe do another video concerning just that, and maybe review his video. But just for the viewers, he has not seen Dougherty's objection. So it's hard to respond to an objection that you're not fairly familiar with. Right?
All I'm going to do is give you my argument. So I don't know what his is. I'm just going to give you mine, and maybe you might see something like, oh, I think this premise is wrong because of what he said here, but I don't know. But here's my argument, and so it goes like this: premise one: if God is omnibenevolent, then He desires genuine eternal love relations with humans. Premise two: if God desires genuine eternal love relations with humans, then He creates humans with libertarian freedom, because premise 2a, a genuine eternal love relationship between God and humans necessarily requires that humans possess libertarian freedom. And I'll defend that elsewhere. Premise 3, if God creates humans with libertarian freedom, then He allows humans to experience suffering, because 3a, suffering can result from libertarian free humans, and 3b, God created a world in which He knew, middle knowledge, that unless He permitted moral, natural, and all kinds of evil, some would not freely choose to eternally persevere the suffering-free state of affairs in the new heavens and new earth. And 2 Corinthians 4:17 is a great verse backing that up. I can get into that later. Premise 4, God is omnibenevolent. Conclusion, therefore, God allows humans to experience all kinds of suffering. So it seems to me, and as I noted in my book, that this syllogism makes use of all three of the essential ingredients of what I call the soteriological view of Molinism. And I point out that no other competing view of God's sovereignty has logical access to that specific argument. So that's where at least prima facie, I'm going to disagree with somebody who claims otherwise, but I'm always willing to consider their argument.
All right. Now you could elaborate, or do you want to go to the questions? There are a lot of questions.
It's up to you.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of questions. So let's address some of them. Okay. So the first thing is what you said earlier in the beginning, and maybe I don't know if you meant it, or if you did, just fine. But Nick says, why do you consider divine simplicity an essential attribute of God?
Well, divine simplicity is actually is an attribute that's debated. So I affirm the simplicity of God, but then the Thomist is going to say no, I don't, because many of them. I know Thomists who are also Molinists. So anyway, I'm going down another rabbit trail. But what I think simplicity means is that God is simple in the fact that He's not composed of parts. Now, different Christians will look at that and say, "Oh, well, what about metaphysical parts?" Okay, well, what do you mean by that? So what I mean by simplicity is probably different than what others mean by it. When I use the word simple, I mean that God is not composed. Is definitely not composed of physical parts because He's the creator of all physical. So that's what I mean by it. He's an immaterial being. He's not a complex. It's not like He's a well-oiled machine, as it were. He doesn't have those kinds of parts and cogs and gears and or anything like that. He's an immaterial substance, and that's to me seems pretty simple. That doesn't mean
the part of the question, because there's a notion of divine simplicity that's unique to a lot of Catholic doctrine. I think you mentioned Thomism. Which is I thought it was something like that God's attributes are all the same, like, or something like that. That His love is okay. That's not you're referring to the fact that like God is not like a water molecule in the sense that He's composed of different parts of that that bring together a whole. Okay.
Yeah, I don't like that view. That doesn't make sense to me. I just yesterday I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a Thomist and a Molinist, and so he's got ways of trying to cash that out. But when they start saying that all the attributes are the same, that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so the next question is, do you have a particular view of the Trinity? There are lots of views of the Trinity, so someone was wondering whether you had a particular view.
I do believe that God is one substance with three sets of cognitive faculties. If I'd like, that's how I would. So I would say, as a substance dualist, I think that I'm a soul with a body, and my soul has one set of cognitive faculties. And I say that God is. So I'll say that my soul is one spiritual substance, as it were, not a physical substance. So it's a spiritual substance with one set of cognitive faculties, and that God is one spiritual substance with three sets of cognitive faculties. And I say, what's the big deal?
Next question. So we're going to get through these pretty fast. Can anything happen outside of God's foreknowledge?
What can happen and what will happen are two different things. And so I think that the can or the could, so I differentiate between could, would, and will. So what could and would happen are different than what will happen. And so yes, I do think, and in fact, I do have a little argument here. See if I can find it. It'll be quick. If I can find it, it'll be quick. Let me see. Okay. So a lot of people think, hey, if you can't trick God, if you can't do other than what God knows, then you're not free. And I would just say, hey, that's not the definition of libertarian freedom. The definitions of libertarian freedom are either that something or someone else does not causally determine everything about you. If it's ever true that when you choose or act or do anything, if that's not causally determined by something or someone else, then you're free in the libertarian sense. And then some would say that if you've ever got the ability to or the opportunity to exercise an ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each compatible with your nature at the moment of choice, then you've got libertarian freedom. That's a nice fancy way of saying the ability to choose otherwise. So if either of those are ever true, then you've got libertarian freedom. There's sometimes when I argue and I can't prove the ability to do otherwise, but I can show that it's got to be true that you weren't causally determined by something or someone else, then congratulations, you've got libertarian freedom. But sometimes I think I can show that you've actually got the ability to do otherwise when it comes to thinking and rationality. John Searle, an atheist, is big on this, and Evan Fales, another atheist. They make great arguments for this. They've influenced me a lot. so they're atheists who are also libertarians when it comes to rationality and reason-based knowledge and things like that. They'll say, if you don't have libertarian freedom to think, then you're not a free thinker. So much for that. For that, that's where I got Free Thinking Ministries from, is because I was interacting with the local atheist group called the Free Thinkers all the time. Anyway, let me just say this: God, if this is true, I'll give you three propositions. If it's true that God knows that Sally would freely choose X instead of not X, even though she could have chosen X, if he were to create her in a non-causal deterministic circumstance, we'll just call that non-causal deterministic circumstance C, right? So God knows how Sally would freely choose, or that she would freely choose X. All right. Now God, then, knowing how she would freely choose, and again, I said knowing how she would freely choose, then God creates Sally in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. So what changes? Now God knows Sally will freely choose X instead of non-X, even though she could have chosen non-X, in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. So here's the takeaway. Just because the word would transforms to will, the word freely doesn't magically disappear. So a lot of people think that freedom, if God knows how I will freely choose, and I'm not free to trick God, then I don't have libertarian freedom. But that's not the definition. So God can create a free creature whom he does not causally determine, and know how that free creature will freely choose. And if they were to choose differently, that would have changed God's foreknowledge or middle knowledge. And so anyway, to answer the question, I would say, off the top of my head here, I might want to think about this a little more, but my first reaction is to say something can happen outside of God's foreknowledge, but if it did, then his foreknowledge would have been different. So maybe that's a cop-out. I don't know.
All right. One more question from Brian. And then this is a very common question that I get. The idea of freedom, sin, and being in heaven. Right?
Yeah.
So I think the argument runs this way, that God set up heaven in a way where we if someone believes, we have free will, that's compatible with not sinning, right? So you probably, I don't know if you've heard this question or not, but
Oh yeah, I did. I write about it. Yeah, I've got blogs on it, YouTube videos on this question, and in my book, I do believe that we have libertarian freedom in heaven, and I think that's why we exist in a suffering-filled world right now. So think about it. Let me read his question. Can we sin in heaven? I would say yes, you can. But you won't. You'll be too smart for that. So in a sense, somebody will say, well, what do you mean by can? Now you have to get into the word abilities and things like that. You'll definitely have it's like I have the intrinsic ability to jab this pen into my eye right now, but why would I? I'm too smart for that. There's nothing about my physical being that's preventing me from jabbing this into my eye. But why would I? I'm too smart for that. I've learned from pain and suffering what would happen. In fact, anyway, I think that this world prepares us for a perfect state of affairs. So you think about, if Christian theism is true, if biblical Christianity is true, then Adam and Eve and Satan and a third of all the angels were created in a perfect, suffering-free paradise in God's presence, and they all took it for granted and wrecked it. So when Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:17, and Paul is being sarcastic here because elsewhere he gives an entire list of all of his suffering. So Paul knew what it was like to suffer, but Paul calls his long list of suffering a light momentary affliction. And he says that these light momentary afflictions, right, several decades of suffering on this rock, right, these light momentary afflictions prepare us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, right? So it's preparing us for eternity. Well, the question is raised, how exactly does pain, evil, and suffering, this long list of pain, evil, and suffering, and things that just aren't right about this place. How does that prepare us for heaven? Well, now think about it. If you die today and you open your eyes and you're with Jesus and you're in a perfect paradise and free from all pain, evil, and suffering, and you're like, now this is the way things ought to be. This is the way it ought to be. And that's how I define evil, actually, is the way things ought not be. All right. So now you're in heaven, or the new heavens, new earth, whatever it is. And you're like, this is the way things ought to be. Question: will you take that state of affairs for granted? Unlike Adam, Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels. You see, they were created in a suffering-free state of affairs and took it for granted and wrecked it. We have learned how bad pain, evil, and suffering is here. Why it's stupid. I could say I've learned why it's stupid not to love all other people, from God, each person of the Trinity, to each person the Trinity's ever created, even those who consider me to be an enemy. I've learned that it's stupid not to love all people all the time. And so, because I've learned that, just like there's no way I would, even though I could, there's no way I would jab this pen into my eye. There's no way I would do that. And so in the same way in heaven, even though you could jab a pen in somebody else's eye or your own, or you could sin, you never would, because you'll be too smart for that. So I think that that's what Paul is meaning here, is really no pain, no gain. Paul is basically the first one to say that. And you can also see that echoed in James and all the passages about how God uses evil for good and things like that. I think ultimately we do have free will in heaven. What do I mean by that? God is not causally determining all of my choices in heaven. And that I will have the same ability, the same intrinsic ability to reject God, just like Adam and Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels did. But I never would. And I definitely never will, because I've learned from these few decades here on this rock. So that's my short answer. And I've got a lot more on this in my book and YouTube and website.
All right. Thanks. Sometimes I hear the freedom of choice. I don't know if you've like that, but it seems I've never heard this route, that the route that you gave, but sometimes I hear that God limits our choices. Like, we don't have the choice to fly, but
right.
that doesn't mean that I have no will, right?
Or
but
I don't have an ability. Yeah, and that's exactly right. That's why sorry to interrupt you. But I call this limited libertarian freedom. I think even God has limited libertarian freedom. He's not free to stop existing, right? He's not free to be a quadrinity or anything like that. There's some things that are just necessarily true about him. God is not free not to love. And so I don't have the freedom to flap my arms and fly like a bird. But I do have the freedom to take the stairs, or to take the elevator, or to stay on the bottom floor and think about. So I'll say, it's a limited libertarian freedom. If I ever have the ability and opportunity to choose between a range of alternative options that are each compatible with my nature at the moment of choice, then I've got libertarian freedom. If it's ever true of me that I'm not causally determined by something or someone else, then I've got libertarian freedom. And so it doesn't mean that I have to be free to do all things all the time.
All right. It's always you must get that question a lot, but it's an interesting question.
It's a good question.
So the cynic wants to ask you your view of God's judgments and alleged cruelties in the Old Testament. I guess this speaks to the tension between some people that read the Bible think that there's a very different kind of God in the New Testament than as compared to the Old Testament. And I think he's citing some of the things that they reference as to differentiate the two deities almost. What is your view?
My quick and easy answer would be to punt that ball to Paul Copan. He's a friend and colleague of mine, and he's written a book called Is God a Moral Monster? And so he deals with a lot of these allegations of the Old Testament God. But I primarily, as a Christian, not a Jew, as a Christian, focus on the God that Jesus revealed. And so as Christians, we are Christ followers. And so I spend the vast majority of my time studying the God that Jesus was clear about. And so if there's questions about the Old Testament, then as Christians, we should filter that through Jesus's teachings about God. And so if we're making some conclusions about the God of the Old Testament, but we're not running that through the filter of Jesus and what he's revealing about the true nature of God, then we're going to have we're going to have problems there. Now, I think that Paul Copan does a good job. I'll also say that it's some of these. It's that the first passage in the first book of the whole Bible really provides the logical foundation for equal human rights. And not to mention then what Jesus clarifies about the purpose of life, why we exist. The objective purpose of life, according to Jesus, is to love God and to love all other people, from your neighbors to your enemies, for eternity. That's why you exist, and to miss that mark is sin. And that's what, if one misses that mark for eternity, then we call that hell. But the objective purpose, the reason, God, I say that God created humanity on purpose and for the specific purpose to love all people all the time. And so if that's the case, then there's objective facts about humanity, irrespective of the subjective opinions from humanity. That's how it's grounded. I don't like divine command theory, and people say, oh, well, objective morality is grounded in the commands of God. I say, no, objective morality is better served to say it's grounded in the objective purpose in which humanity was created. And Jesus made it clear what that purpose is, to love everybody all the time. What a great purpose, right? Who doesn't want that to be true?
That's interesting. So you're taking some kind of teleological view of morality and refraining from not accept that goodness is rooted in imperatives, right? So that's to say, in good in terms of something like function, right? And intent rather than imperatives like don't eat. Okay.
Right. Now, I think God's commands put us in an epistemic position to know objective morality, how we ought to live, what we were created for, what's the objective purpose of. I mean, God could create us on purpose and for a specific purpose and never tell us about it. Well, then we'd all be missing the mark all the time.
So you're saying something like goodness metaphysically relies on telos or function, intention, design, but the epistemic question, that's where God's commands come in, right?
Right. Yeah, I would say that goodness and rationality, by the way, are degreed properties. So I get some pushback here, but I make controversial claims, and I say, technically speaking, God is not good and God is not rational. Now, I will, when I'm not being careful, say things like that. But technically speaking, I say goodness and rationality are degreed properties that humans have when we approximate to the perfect standard of love or knowledge. So when we approximate to it, I'll say to a degree that a human approximates to their objective purpose of love, to that same degree he is good, and to a degree that one fails to approximate to that standard or to that mark, to that same degree one is bad. Similarly, when it comes to rationality, to a degree that one approximates to the perfect standard of knowledge, to that same degree one is rational. To a degree that one misses that mark, to that same degree they are irrational. Now, I might need to nuance that a little bit, but that's the basic idea.
That's interesting. I want to ask. So so you're saying that goodness value, that it's credential and it can be found in the purpose of human beings and such. But so it seemed like you were implying that there's a sense in which we wouldn't say God is good, but wouldn't there be in the economy of the Trinity, right? So you have Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the Father, who take different roles and thus different functions, right? Presumably, Jesus is for the Father. The Father is they're for each other, right? And I think it's a kind of functional term, forness, right? That you could still preserve a sense of goodness in the persons of the Trinity.
Well, I mean, there's no standard to which the persons of the Trinity ought to approximate. They share the same, they are the standard. And so they are, God is love. Each person of the Trinity is God. So God is perfect love, and they are not obligated to approximate to a higher standard. They are the standard. And so in that sense, we are created with the objective purpose. If Christianity is true, then we're created on purpose and for the specific purpose to approximate to perfect love. And when we do that, to a degree that we do that, we're good. And to a degree that we miss the mark, we're evil. So think about this, and this is how I remember it. Love backward. So I say that love requires free will. So that same freedom, or at least for created creatures, it requires libertarian freedom to reject love or not. So I have a whole article on my website called The Best Kind of Love, and I talk about why it's true for created creatures and not for God, because God loves necessarily. That's a whole other topic. Where am I go? Oh, love. So the freedom allows us to love, but freedom also allows us to use that same ability to love in a backwards way, which is evil. And that's easy to remember because love backwards is evil, but I'm not a good speller, but that's how I remember it.
Yeah. So I feel like you could take the Kantian move here, though, right? Like to say, because like Kant wants to say there are good things, like when he takes like his categorical imperative, for instance, he thinks that that's good in itself, that you should, that when you do something right, you're doing it for the sake of the categorical imperative, something like that. I'm not a Kantian.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean,
okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And maybe help me out, because you're seeing things from a different perspective here. But for me, the way I see it is the fact that we were created on purpose and for the specific purpose to love makes it objectively true about humans that we ought to love, that we were created for that purpose. And so even if we disagree and we do something else, then we're just subjectively missing reality. So the reality, so a statement that is true corresponds to reality. Reality is the way things are. So is it true, objectively speaking, ontologically speaking, that humans were created for the specific purpose, on purpose and for the specific purpose to love others and to love God? And so if Christianity is true, then you would say that is objectively true about humanity apart from human opinion. So human opinion is irrelevant here. Human opinion can be right or wrong regarding the ontological and objective reality of humanity. So
sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify, do you define objective similarly to Craig? Because Craig defines an objective truth as that which is true above human opinion, right? Is that the kind of sense of objective that you take?
Yeah, and I'm open to yes, but I'm also open to other ways of similar. I mean, I typically say that a statement is objectively true apart from human opinion, or a statement is objectively true if it corresponds to reality. And then the question is, well, what is reality? And I just simply say the way things are, no matter what anybody thinks. And so our opinions are irrelevant when it comes to reality. The question is, can we know reality? And now we get into epistemology. So metaphysics and epistemology kiss at that point. And so, but yeah, I'm kind of, I forgot where I was going with that. So
that's fine. How are you on the time? Do you want to do one or two more questions?
I'm having fun. So I'll go until you stump me, and I'm like, I'm done.
We're very similar then. So okay. So there was a question I wanted to go to. A question I missed here. One second. I'm going to put it up and then you can answer. 1 second. Okay, it's something like in what sense could you have freedom to do otherwise when God does not know the future, but his omnipotence secures it to be the actual world? Now, is this
I feel like we've addressed this question.
Yeah, I think we did.
Okay. I'm just trying to go through it. I want to make sure I'm covering people. Yeah. And so if you put your question way back in the history of YouTube, if you could put it up again, that would be great. I think there was this one, a final question from Brian. Could God have created us differently? As in, could God created a version of me that goes to heaven?
Well, I hope that you do go to heaven. And with Molinism, I offer, this is not on my book, but I'm unpacking this more. I do have an article on it. I offer a view of how universalism is even compatible with Molinism. It's a nuanced view of universalism, to be sure, but it's definitely possible that you do go to heaven, Brian, and I hope you do. I'm a hopeful universalist, as it were. I also show that annihilationism is possible with Molinism, and that the traditional concept of, well, I don't want to say the traditional concept of hell, because I disagree. I don't think that version of hell exists. I tend to think something like what C.S. Lewis wrote about in The Great Divorce. If hell is an eternal state of affairs, I'm kind of thinking it's what C.S. Lewis wrote about. But let's just suppose I'm assuming that Brian is assuming an eternal hell, and that some people are not going to heaven, and that is the view that I think is probably true. And if push comes to shove, it doesn't even have to be push comes to shove. That's my view, even though I'm open to the other possibilities and I don't rule them out. So on that view, could God have created us differently? As in, God could have created a version of me that goes to heaven. Molinists are going to disagree on this and debate each other. So some Molinists will say yes, others will say no. I'm inclined to think that there's some agents who would, when they're not causally determined, for some, I don't know the reason, you have to ask them, but there's some who will reject God's love and grace no matter what, for eternity. Now, there's obviously atheists who reject God's love and grace for a long time and then stop doing that and come back. I know many of them. I know an atheist scientist at the university here, at the secular university, University of Nebraska, who recently thought, wow, I can't argue against the existence of God anymore. And then didn't take much longer before they're like, gosh, this Christianity really seems to make sense of reality. And finally, they went from arguing for atheism for years and years and years to now helping me with the reasonable faith chapter on that campus, being not just a theist, but a Christian theist. So you just don't know. Maybe God did create a version of you that goes to heaven, and it's this version. And I'm also, I offer models of showing what's even possible in the courtroom, as it were. I mean, tell me this, Danny. You think that atheism is probably true, right?
Well, that's a good question. I think that given the philosophical standard concept of God, yes.
Okay. But you wouldn't say, I say you think it's probably true. So that probably might give you a 1% of saying you see that it's at least logically possible for Christianity to be true.
If given that standard of I think on my view, right? On my view, if you grant the three omni properties and you also include infallibility, I don't think it can logically happen. Right now, that's my view. Yeah. I think an open theist. I think that I haven't really investigated open theism, but I think that that's a plausible response.
Okay.
Right.
So let me just make it quick. Suppose you start studying my work more and you're like, oh, even when you grant infallibility, that's not a problem. I don't think it is. Now, even with that said, would you at least say, given the fact that maybe I'm right, Or you say open theism gives you an option to say, it's logically possible that God exists and Jesus loves me. Would you at least just say that much, that it's logically possible, even though you don't think it's true?
If we're talking about something like open theism, I think that could be a plausible
hypothetical. Okay. So here's my question. And I don't want to, I mean, gosh, this is a whole topic for another 2-hour show.
Sure.
Tell me this, Danny, if you die today, and you open your eyes on the other side of death, and you're looking right into the face of Jesus, and he tells you, Danny, I love you so much. Are you going to flip him off, or are you going to fall at his feet and worship him?
I'm going to do the latter. Absolutely.
So here's my question. I think there's some people like Satan who would flip him off. And I've met others, when I ask them that question, they say, no, I would still flip him off. I say, what if he gives you really good reasons for everything that he's done, for everything that's happened to you? They say, I will not bow the knee. Dr. Craig debated an atheist who basically asked the same question, say, I will not bow the knee. I'm like, okay, well then God lets you have it your way. And I think that's why the eternal version, or the great divorce view of hell makes sense. But for you, Danny, I would say, gosh, you get hit by a truck today. Now, a lot of Christians are going to be like, Tim, how can you even say this stuff? We're supposed to say at the moment of death. I agree. I agree with Hebrews when it says at death comes judgment. I just say, dude, in that courtroom in heaven is the judge that loves you more than you can possibly imagine. And so I'm not going to rule out anything that can happen there. Man, I probably didn't answer his question, but I know it's a controversial view, and many Christians might not hold it, but I've written on this in my website, and so people want to look into this more, it's there. I mean, so I would say this, Dan, I think you're in a good position as an atheist to say, well, gosh, if Christianity is true, I'm going to worship Jesus for eternity. I think that's good.
Yeah, I like to think so. If I don't have, I mean, there's always acrasia, which is a fancy word of saying weakness of will. So I might have, I think there's this, because one of the responses that I like to divine hiddenness is that God is not, it seems like on Christianity, this is my view, so I don't know who I'm characterizing. On my interpretation of Christianity is that God doesn't just want mere belief. Right. God relationship. Right. So the idea, the standard divine hiddenness argument is something like, well, why doesn't God just snap his fingers and make it such that he can show his existence to everyone and everyone comes with the belief that he exists? And by the way, I would take that to be a kind of, as you would say, causal determinism, right? They would cause people to believe in it. Yeah. Now, it doesn't seem like that if you understand Christianity in terms of relationship, then that's not a sufficient condition for those sorts of things, right? So there's always the question about, okay, let's say I have reasons to believe in Christianity, and I do, and let's say they're justifications, and it's true, I know it. I mean, then there's the hardest step, right? The hardest step is what, right? Following. So, yes. Right? Following is right. Very difficult. And so, to me, that's why I feel like apologetics is very important if you're a Christian. Philosophy is very important and everything. But I think the hardest part of Christianity is not, coming to a justification. It's following a particular interpretation of the text, and that I don't know if I could do. And because just on my interpretation, that it's very difficult. I would have to give up a lot. My mindset would have to be very different, even if I came to the belief that God exists and the Christian God at that, right? I wonder whether I can follow such a thing, even willingly, right? I don't, it's always been a puzzle for me, right? I mean, but this seems like I can't be the only one, right? Everyone thinks that if they believe in God, that they do, if you show these atheists enough evidence and the best arguments, that they suddenly will be a Christian. I don't believe half of it, right? I might get some people that wish they could, that they're so, I'm gonna use my Christian terms, but I'm gonna speak like a Christian for a second, so I don't want to fool anyone. I'm not, but there are so many people that love their sin more than the whatever kinds of consequences there is from being righteous, right? And I think that that is not something to be underestimated. Right? Okay, you convince these people with your arguments. Okay. Oh, God snapped his fingers and revealed to you he exists. Now you just enter chapter 1, right? And maybe I have the wrong interpretation of Christianity. Maybe it's not as bad. Maybe it's just a matter of getting into the habit of being righteous, right? And so, but you see, so I'm not saying there's no way I can't be a Christian. I'm just saying that it's a difficult thing, I think, on my interpretation. But that's my view, at least.
You know, one of my friends, Sean McDowell, you probably know who he is, his son of Josh McDowell. And I saw it, was it yesterday? No, on Sunday, he tweeted that his pastor said, coming to Jesus is free and doesn't cost you anything. Following Christ will cost you everything. And I thought, wow, that's well said. It does cost, and it does require some sacrifice. But I would say, there's things that I want to do, that especially at first, when I first devoted my life to Christ, I was in my 20s. I grew up thinking it was true. I always thought it was true. But then when I decided to devote my life to following Christ, man, I mean, I had to make some big changes in my life, and I didn't like it. But as you said, it was some baby steps, and I felt a lot of grace along the way. And the cool thing is on the Christian story, we're not called to be perfect. We're just called to come to Christ and ask him to work in our lives. Let him influence us, not causally determine us, but let him influence us. And he knows we're going to make mistakes. The same way I know my son is going to keep messing up. Now that he's 18 years old and being a stupid teenager sometimes, man, I love him so much. I don't require him to be perfect. I don't want him to make mistakes because it brings him pain. It ultimately brings him more pain and suffering, but he's going to do what he's going to do. I try to influence him as much as I can. I give him freedom, and I love him no matter what he does, even if he flips me off. That's the old parable of the prodigal son that Jesus talks about. The father's love for his son never changed. It has never changed. It's always there 100%, but he didn't causally determine him. He didn't go out and send his servants to arrest him and bring him back. He gave him freedom, and he was always one step away. I once heard a song says, you say you've walked 5,000 steps away, but don't you know that he's only one step back? And because his love is just always there, not causally determining you, but just always being one step back. And so I think, you talk about how it is hard to follow. It is. And there's always a struggle. Even today, I still struggle. I want to sin. And sometimes I fail. Well, gosh, God doesn't require me to be perfect. And so that's what I love about grace and the story of Christ and Christianity. I think it's perfect being theology.
I do like the story. I really do. It's moving to me, but I don't understand. Like, some people think that the story is quite gross. I was talking to some atheists about it. Like, they were mocking the story. I'm like, I kind of like the story, right? Yeah. I mean, because now this is a purely narrative. I'm not an expert on how Christianity grew. Okay. And I'm not even saying, I don't want to make a strong claim here, but I will say this, right? There is something about the setting of early Christianity, right? That you had these gods, right? That were promiscuous, evil, backstabbing liars, right? Mm-hmm. And the last thing that they would do was die for you. And mm-hmm. then suddenly you had this new doctrine, right, that emerged out of Judaism, right? That told a very different story. And I think that has to do, there's something there in terms of why people like the story if it, you know, let's bracket the justifications and the philosophy and the historical evidence and all that. But there's something I like about the story in terms of how it reverses what the Greeks and the Romans, how they construed their gods in terms of self-centered. And then instead, God is dying for you.
Right.
Right. I like that. And now, and this is just a matter of taste and opinion, right, for me. But there was one other thing I was going to say, but I forgot. Maybe we could end on this note. But before we do, okay, what work are you doing? Any kind of work now? Are you writing a new book? What are your interests now?
I am working on a couple things. Whippenstock, who published my book, is talking to me about writing a study guide for it. So, kind of a, you know, this is around 300 pages. So it'd be a much smaller little study guide to read as you're, it's asking questions that you can find in the text and asking other questions to help you go deeper. And then I'll be adding some other things that since writing the book, I realized, I should have included this part about when I'm talking about, what's it mean to have an ability to do otherwise, and because even the compatibilists who affirm determinism will say, well, you still, like I say it this way, I have the ability to play the bass guitar, but there's no bass guitar in the studio right now. And so I don't have the ability to play you a funky bass line at this moment. But I do still possess the ability, even though I don't possess the opportunity. So really, by ability to do otherwise, oftentimes what we mean is the opportunity to exercise an ability to do one thing or another. And so I wish I would have said that in my book. I'll be unpacking these things in little sections called Going Deeper and things like that. I'm also, though, I'd say one of the biggest not pushbacks or objections, but there seems to be. So chapter 12 was what I focused on, what I call the free thinking argument. And I think you're one of the few atheists who would have logical access to it. But most people, I don't want to spend too much time right now.
You don't have logical access. I'm sorry, sir.
What's that?
I thought I might have misunderstood you. Did you say I'm one of the few atheists that have logical access
to my argument? So I'm making an argument that I think is ultimately it deductively proves several things, and then abductively I try to say that it's God that is the best explanation. I think you would be an atheist like John Searle and Evan Fales, who might not make the abductive move, but would affirm at least some of the deductive conclusions. There's 3 deductive conclusions there. And I'd be interested in talking to you more about that. But so that's a philosophical chapter. And so I've been asked by several people, including other philosophers, saying, hey, Tim, you need to not just give us a little chapter in a theology book, but do an entire book that's focused on a rigorous philosophical defense of the free thinking argument. Now, I love that idea, but since I told you I'm not an official philosopher, I'm just a philosophically inclined theologian, I figured I needed to co-author this with a bona fide PhD philosopher. So I am partnering and co-authoring a book that's going to be focused on a rigorous philosophical defense of the free thinking argument. And we just started writing the first chapter. So probably won't be out for a while, but I'm really looking forward to this and looking forward to actually hearing some objections to others as I'm working on this, so I can work on this.
I got you there. I give the link in my description of your book.
Cool.
So you'll see that in the next 5 seconds. Okay. But look, I'm glad you decided to come on the show or the channel. We really appreciate it. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe me, because I'm trying, I'm a new content creator, so I need those subscriptions. But I appreciate everyone's the chat is active, and we got 15 viewers, which is pretty good for this sort of stream, and there's an interest out there, and I want to capture it, right? And I'm glad that I'm doing alongside with people like Tim, or Dr. Stratton.
No,
But
you can call me Tim.
Okay. But yeah, I appreciate everyone's participation. I think I'll be coming out with more videos throughout the week. This is not, I want to say something. This is not an atheist channel. Okay. It's not a theist channel either. This is supposed to be educational, right? All of my videos, I mean, occasionally I might be critical of something. Like I'm critical of presuppositional apologetics. I think that's a lazy way of doing Christian apologetics.
Amen to that.
But I do have some videos, and but for the most part, like 90%, the videos are benign, and they don't in terms of whether you're theist or not. They go over like basic philosophical terms, like I went over a priori, a posteriori, very basic distinction in philosophy, and amongst others like analytic, synthetic, necessary, and contingent. Those sorts of stuff are very useful philosophical devices, and I just explore them very simply in short videos. So. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking the video right now. You should do that. But thanks for coming on, Dr. Stratton, and supporting us.
Well, thank you, Danny. I think you're awesome. I'm glad to now have gained a new friend, and I do consider you a friend now moving forward. And I just look forward to more awesome conversations together.
Bye, everyone. I'll see y'all later.